So we're here today with Startup Grind Kansas City. For joining us. We'll quick start values. All right, this is Startup Grind Kansas City, and our conversation today is with Michael Weickert of Pacylex. He's the CEO and an entrepreneur at heart. So we're going to have a conversation with Michael about diamonds in the rough for those farms that maybe other organizations or companies will. And for joining us today, Michael, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can chat. Nice to see you.
You too. Delighted to be here. Thanks so much.
Yeah. When you and I first met, you were a program manager for this little company called Inhale Therapeutics that was doing groundbreaking work.
All the companies I work with now are even littler, so.
And doing groundbreaking work.
Yes.
So that's the stuff that I want to talk to you about today. You started there as a project manager, but they actually approached you to start an anti-infectious unit and to look at other different molecules and things like that. So let's talk about that a little bit, because I think that was the start of really where you are today and your current positions.
That's a good jumping off point for a journey. I started as a scientist coming out of NIH at the National Cancer Institute, worked at two companies before Inhale, had started on the bench, but very quickly realized that drug development is not necessarily bench work. It's about the medical need. It's about how to position it in the competition. It's about the market. Those are the decisions, the factors that the companies are going to use to decide what medicines to advance. So I moved into things that are going to be closer to those decision points. And project management was one of those where you would see the entire spectrum of what goes into drug development. So, even in larger companies that are public, and Inhale was a public company at the time you met me there.
Right.
They have to be innovative. They have to, grow or die, right?
Right.
So a company like Inhale, which is not a big pharma and can't afford to pay hundreds of millions of dollars for its drug pipeline every time they want to innovate, they have to do things, on their own. So when the company decided that we wanted to migrate from being a partnered products company, where a partner in the pharmaceutical industry would pay for everything that we did, and we didn't innovate other than applying our technology to their drug, and decided to take our technology and find drugs that we could apply it to on our own. That was a real step for the company. And so that's where I got tapped to go create an Antiinfectious business unit from scratch inside the company. And this is what we now call intrapreneurship. So you're an insider doing entrepreneurial work within an organization. So that's kind of where this whole journey started, was the entrepreneurship opportunity I was given by Inhale to go and create a new business unit for the company from scratch.
Right.
I didn't know how to do this, and the company really didn't offer much guidance. It wasn't like they said, here's how we do that, because it hadn't been done before. So This is also like a lot of entrepreneurs. So you start out not having a blueprint, not knowing what you need to do, not knowing how it needs to be done. And so the benefit for me was having done that inside a company instead of starting out from scratch on my own, maybe out of an academic lab or out of a private practice, is that I had some level of support. I did have income from my salary, and I did have experts around me that I could tap and say, hey, how do you do this? Or how do you do that? Or, what do we need for this to happen? And those experts were able to help me, in a whole team setting, come up with the plans for creating an Antiinfectious business unit and creating within that unit multiple products that could then advance into development.
And this is what was at a time before entrepreneurial spirit. Entrepreneurs were cool, right? If I'm not mistaken, this was in the early 2000s.
I wouldn't say I'm quite that old. We're not quite that old. I mean, Inhale was in Silicon Valley. I mean, we were surrounded by,
Yeah.
Entrepreneurial adventures that had been going on for decades. And of course, the whole venture capital group ecosystem within Silicon Valley is founded on lots of entrepreneurship, not always in pharma. It could be in tech, software, aerospace.
It seems like pharma came along later in the entrepreneurial world, if you will.
Harder. I mean, it's harder to create a pharmaceutical startup because the capital required is so enormous. You can write software with a $50,000 budget. You're not going to develop a drug with a $50,000 budget.
Right. So that actually takes us into a little bit of the challenge that you face when you're a pharma startup. What are some of those right off the bat? You just mentioned budget. To your point, you can develop an app or a tool, if you will, for $50,000, at least a minimal viable product that someone might be interested in. You can't do that in pharma. So what are those challenges and sort of how do you go about them?
Yeah. So, the two things that pharma needs most is capital and experience. And unlike a lot of other things, if you're writing an app or something, as you were describing, you don't need a ton of experience in order to be able to create something that people might use. But in pharma, it's a regulated industry, and you need to show a burden of proof that's enormous in order to be allowed to put it into people in the first place, to test it in people. And then, of course, a lot of evidence from the clinical testing in people to show that it's safe and effective that would allow it to be registered as a product that could be marketed. So the burden is huge. And the typical cost of a pharmaceutical product is at the floor, $100 million to get it to market, and, up to $1 billion to get it to market or more. I mean, at Inhale, as we know, the inhaled insulin, which was the flagship product for the company, took almost $2.5 billion to get to market. So It is a very expensive proposition. And so the challenge of getting the skills and the capital together is a really important one, because you've got to convince investors that the idea, the product, the opportunity is sufficient to warrant putting in tens and eventually hundreds of millions of dollars behind the effort with whatever the team is that's there, that they have sufficient expertise, and that you're going to have enough to protect this if it's successful in the marketplace with intellectual property and regulatory benefits, et cetera. So there's an awful lot of challenges with that. And the challenge is both collecting a team of experienced people who are willing to start from scratch, and with that team, raising the capital necessary to undertake that endeavor. And, it's not always successful.
Right.
Pharma is terrible. I mean,
well, you make me a whole other conversation that we could have, when you're talking about $100 million to market, and we have consumers who do not understand, why am I paying $500 a pill? Well, there's a whole conversation around that, because you're paying
a different episode.
Yeah, that could be just a whole other episode. You're absolutely right. But that makes me ask the question, we talked about this when we were preparing for the call or for the session. That's where these war stories or these diamonds in the rough happen. If you remember, I remember the Inhale origin story, John getting an idea. Hey, I wonder if this could work. And guess what? It worked. I mean, there were other issues with efficacy and safety, but the initial idea worked, and it took off, and people wanted that, right? And other companies have followed suit to address those issues, but we know there's others out there. So let's talk about those and how they rise to the top, or how you find them.
So, life science diamonds in the rough are what I consider to be innovations arising outside of the typical ecosystems of Harvard, Stanford, Mayo Clinic, et cetera, places where there's already high prestige, very well-known faculty or researchers or clinicians Lots of capital is available at those institutions. Lots of investors come there regularly to see what's going on. And those are the people that review the grants, that edit the journals. And so that ecosystem is very sort of self-reinforcing. If you have a theory in that ecosystem, then your job is to confirm that theory. The real job of anybody working in medicine should be to find solutions to the medical problems. And the problem is that if you're in an ecosystem that's just about confirming a theory, you tend to end up with confirmation bias and a lot of other things that inhibit you from actually finding real, genuine solutions. But people who are out in the boonies, I mean, people who are at institutions that are not part of that ecosystem, that don't have, and aren't editors of the major journals, that aren't part of that and need to protect that, they can think a lot more freely about, how do I solve this problem? When they try stuff that other people would just poo-poo, we know that won't work because we know this is the right theory. And in so doing, some of them find solutions. Some of them really find breakthrough solutions to problems. But the problem is they're out in the boonies and no one's going to listen to them because they're not part of that ecosystem. So it's a really awkward situation where the people who are more likely to find solutions are also more likely to be ignored.
So it's getting them to bubble up to the top somehow outside of that ecosystem.
Well, the other risk for a lot of those folks is that they don't have experience in how to transition from an idea to a product or a development, candidate that can actually be supported. And they don't know how to pitch it, and they don't know how to collect the right skill sets in the team to be successful at executing on what needs to happen next. So, there's a lot of gaps usually from things arising out of the sort of normal ecosystems and what needs to happen for success. So what I've done is I have, for the last almost 15 years, worked with startup companies, many of them out of this sort of diamonds in the rough profile that have genuine breakthroughs, but need somebody who can ground them in reality and provide the support for all the work that needs to be done and how to tell the story to venture capital. And because I'm located in Silicon Valley, that's a lot easier for me to do than some of the companies I work with. Like, one of the companies I just did a Series A with is in Edmonton, Alberta. It's hard to get further out of the, Edmonton, Alberta, except that the company I'm currently working on a financing for is in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So another
even further.
A biotech.
Right. So even further. But a good example of how medicine often rejects innovation, because it's, people think of science as sort of the cutting edge and so on and so forth, which is nice. But unfortunately, science and medicine and, all sorts of fields are conservative fundamentally. And that means that they tend to have a certain amount of inertia around their current thinking. And it's very difficult to change direction and think differently. The people don't, the field doesn't run to embrace it. There will be people within the field that will be open-minded and think new things are really cool and be willing to embrace them right away. But a lot of people will say, no, we know that's not right. Can't be right. It doesn't fit what we currently know. And a great example of that is gastric ulcers. So in 1984, Warren and another scientist, another doctor in Australia, whose name is eluding me at the moment, they discovered that Helicobacter pylori causes gastric ulcers. And that was poo-pooed for a while until the evidence sort of became overwhelming over the course of a decade. Everybody was able to repeat the results. They were able to show more and more data. And eventually by 1994, the NIH said, hey, you know what? They convened a panel, and the panel said, you know what? This really does seem to be right. And so by 97, groups were working on diagnostic kits for gastric ulcers to detect Helicobacter pylori, and that would enable you to treat with antibiotics. And a 3-week course of antibiotics would cure you of a disease that had been considered chronic, that you would live with your whole life, and that you would treat with diet, stress, and lifestyle. I mean, when I was growing up, my dad had gastric ulcers. That's what he got. He got antacids, and he told to, eat bland foods and, not get so stressed out.
which he was never capable of doing, but that was what he was prescribed.
Right.
So the interesting thing is that a Greek physician named John Weickert back in the late 50s had discovered that an antibiotic concoction could cure his patients of their gastric ulcers. And he patented this, received a patent in Greece in 1961, tried to publish his results from treating thousands of patients in JAMA, and it was rejected. And the Greek medical authorities fined him for malpractice. So in 61, the solution had been patented and shown to work eventually in tens of thousands of Greek patients. But the medical, sort of community was not ready to accept that this was correct and rejected it, and obviously very soundly rejected it. And he didn't live long enough to see, this resurrected in Australia. And of course, the Australian physicians got the Nobel Prize because John Weickert was dead. You're not eligible for the prize when you're dead. So people who got the recognition for this discovery were the people who rediscovered it, 25 years after he did.
That's really interesting. That you can't. It goes back to storytelling when you and I were talking earlier. Again, if you might have the next best thing to solving that next best problem, but if you can't tell your story and you can't get people to have that gut feeling of, I want to learn more, going to be discovered. And you do that when you're working with these companies. And, how do you're dealing with a scientist, and we both know plenty of scientists who are very in their lane and very linear, and drawing that out cannot be easy.
Well, I'm a scientist too. So that helps because I can relate to what they're doing on their terms. Secondly, a lot of the story they have to tell, they don't know. I mean, they know the science, but they don't know about drug development, perhaps. They don't know about the market analysis you need to do. They don't know about the competitive landscape in which the product could be introduced in the future. They don't know about the regulatory requirements and the clinical development requirements and the preclinical requirements. They don't know about a lot of stuff. So that's a bunch of the story. That right there is a whole ton of the story that you have to be able to tell investors, because investors don't want to hear about, I got this really cool science and I'm going to, take it to market, because they then go, well, you don't know what you're talking about. You haven't laid out any of the stuff we need to know about how that would work. You have to know about reimbursement and pricing. Okay. You have to know that you can make money from this. You have to know about how you're going to exit at the end of the day. You're going to take this product to what stage? And at that stage, what is pharma willing to pay for that product? And what data would you have to have collected by then to show enough evidence that pharma is going to actually buy it from you or license it from you, or whatever you expect your exit to be? Or if you think you're going to do an IPO, what do you think you're going to have that's going to be compelling enough to warrant an IPO and support a reasonable price for an IPO that would give investors what they call liquidity, the ability to trade in their shares and get cash for them? So all that stuff, physicians and most scientists in academia, they don't have much experience with all that unless they've done this before.
Right.
Those are the kind of people that I'm there to help fill the gaps in. I mean, I do want to tell their science story in a way that puts it in the proper context, because I see pitches all the time from academics and they're all about the science. And it's sort of like, the science is great, so therefore you'll want to take this on. And investors aren't in the business of, most of them aren't in the business of building companies from scratch.
Right. Well, and they're probably not scientists either. Right. So to them, the science might be a piece of it.
Yeah, but they always, if they aren't themselves sufficiently versed in the area or the field that's being explored, then they bring in experts that can help them.
Oh, okay.
That are part of their advisory board, and those people will help them assess the science. So that they can take care of assessing the science, but what they want is they want to invest in a team. Okay. They want to invest in a company, not just a science project. And so a company is a team of people who knows what they need to do and can execute because they have sufficient experience. And that's where a lot of early stage pharmaceutical endeavors coming out of academia are, falling short, is they don't have a team. And it's a catch-22. You don't have any money. How do you hire the team? You don't have the team. Nobody wants to invest in you. So that's one of the biggest dilemmas for any new thing coming out of an academic institution or a medical practice, is that catch-22. I don't have enough money to hire all the experts. And maybe they don't know enough about what the expertise is needed to be able to figure out who the right candidates are. So it's a gap.
Yeah, that is a gap, because I would think if you're sitting in an academia environment, they have the money or the machine to maybe move it forward or take it to a place where Big Pharma might step in.
So some institutions are trying to sort of fill some of that gap. So we call it the valley of death. It's the gap between an academic research project that's typically supported by grants and a pharmaceutical development project that's typically supported by venture. And in between, there's work that has to be done to show that it's non-toxic, that it can be put into people. There's regulatory work that has to be done in a pre-IND meeting with the FDA and an IND filing. There's phase 1 safety studies that need to be done. And a lot of that, most investors now want to see all that done.
Oh, interesting.
And of course, there's no money in grants for most of that. I mean, some of it, but not all of it. So like, for example, Stanford has a Spark program, and I'm a Spark mentor, and Spark is a organization that picks about a dozen projects a year from the medical school that faculty and students are pursuing, and provides them with a little bit of support and a ton of expertise. So the Spark mentors, which in each meeting, there are over 100 Spark mentors in attendance that cover the gamut of pharmaceutical development and medical device development, and can offer feedback and advice, and can be engaged outside of the meetings by the Spark projects so that they have access to experts. And that's extraordinarily helpful to them. But that's Stanford. I mean, when you're in a marquee institution, you have tons of support. You have tons of support from experts. You have tons of support from capital.
Alumni.
You have tons of support from the outside. And it's when you're outside of that kind of ecosystem that you really struggle, because, you know, that support doesn't exist. When I talk to people in Edmonton about, you know, what they're doing and the kind of organizations they're trying to create, they just don't have the critical mass and the expertise to actually make it fully functional. They can do little pieces of it, but they can't fill the whole bucket.
Wow, that just, again, I feel like there's a whole other conversation in that. You know, again, you know, part of this too is sort of educating people on why it takes so long for new drugs to come to market. You know, the obstacles that are facing there, that path that you just talked about, from the lab to clinical 1, where you have some data and people might be interested. That's what, 3 years or so? Yeah.
It can be easily 3 years or longer. It depends on, you know, kind of where your starting point is.
Right.
But generally, from the time you have what we call, so people usually start with a chemical lead. For example, if you're doing a small molecule drug, and a chemical lead then needs a lot of proof of concept to become a candidate, a development candidate. And then you do an IND package, which is toxicology studies and a bunch of other studies to show that it has properties that are sufficient to warrant testing in humans. And then you get approval to do that. And then you do your phase 1 testing for everything except oncology drugs in normal volunteers to show that it's safe before you start testing patients. So that whole process, and, you know, each one of those steps is at least a year. It's at least a year to go from lead to candidate. It's at least a year to get your IND through authorization. And it's at least a year generally to do your phase 1 studies. So, you know, 3 years is a good benchmark.
And at that time, you probably have no real revenue coming in.
Well, you certainly never have a revenue technically until you're on the market. The only revenue you could have technically is you could have grant revenue, which would be booked as revenue. You could have partner revenue, which is the partners paying some of the development costs to you to support the development, which is technically revenue. But, you know, you're not going to have revenue in the sense of you're going to be selling software or an app, and you're going to have some kind of money coming in from sales. You're not going to have any sales ever because you're going to be presumably either acquired by a pharmaceutical company, or you're going to partner your product with a pharmaceutical company that's going to do the sales, and you're going to get income from royalties, milestones, that kind of thing.
Right. Okay. Well, let's talk about your current venture, Pacylex. And
one of them.
One of them, right? But this is the one where you just got your Series A funding.
Yeah, that's right.
And maybe talk about that story and where were you in that development process? Are you at that phase 1 piece where it was pretty easy to sell the story? And maybe talk a little bit about the story.
Pretty easy to sell the story. It's never easy to sell the story.
Yeah.
So I joined Pacylex in December 2017. And at the time, they had some animal proof of concept that was pretty compelling. But they had not yet started any work on, pre-development activities like toxicology studies and so forth. They hadn't really started work on a manufacturing process that would be sufficient to support toxicology and clinical studies. Manufacturing for any kind of pharmaceutical product needs to conform to certain standards. It's called good manufacturing practices, but it's actually a set of codified standards that you need to follow. So you need to create a robust manufacturing process that's going to deliver the same thing every time. And that's what the standards and analysis that goes into manufacturing pharmaceutical products is all about. But you got to lay the groundwork for that at the beginning. I mean, when you do your toxicology studies, you want it to be material representative of what you're going to put into people. Otherwise, it's not very useful. It doesn't really tell you if the material you're going to put in people is different. And then the material you put into people, you want to be representative of something you can make over and over again. And then, obviously, once you have those steps done, you're going to engage with the regulatory authorities, typically with a pre-IND meeting, get feedback from them as to what their expectations are and whether or not your plan is consistent with those expectations. But you have to ask them questions. They don't tell you anything. You have to ask them specific questions, and then they respond to your questions. And that's how you get a sense of whether or not you're on track. So it's a little bit of a, very scripted dance with the regulators generally. And then
they're not going to tell you what they're looking for. They want you to tell them.
You have to show that you know what you're doing. Obviously, if you go in there, and one of the worst questions you can ask is, what should we do?
Oh, yeah.
Or what do you want from us about this? Anything you do that's open-ended like that, they'll come back with an answer, but the answer will also entail a lot more scrutiny of your future because we don't believe you know what you're doing. I mean, you should be able to know what you're doing based on the guidance documents that the FDA regularly publishes. And from those, you should be able to work out what you need to do. And you should have experienced people on your team that know. And so what you should be saying is, we are following, ICH guidelines. We're following, these guidelines. This is what we're doing. Will this be satisfactory for this indication that we're going to pursue with this drug? And, that should be, everything should be a yes, no answer. Now, it doesn't mean they'll just say yes or they'll just say no. They may say yes, but you should also consider this, or you should also add this, or you should also do, these other things, or we will be expecting more later.
So their expertise starts to come in as well.
Their expertise will be communicated to you. And the thing with the FDA is the FDA has access to every other product that's ever been submitted, not just marketed, but submitted. So they've seen data on a ton of stuff that has never been published. That's never been out in the public domain, because that's part of the submission packages. And a lot of companies try to keep that data secret. Data on toxicity of compounds. You don't see a lot of publications about how toxic my compound was.
Right.
The FDA sees all of that. So the FDA may come back with responses that you don't anticipate because they just have access to more information.
Right.
And they may know that there's risks that you don't know about because of the other things that they've studied or seen submitted before.
So you started in 2017. Here we are 4 years later, and you have a Series A funding. How many pitches? How many no's? What was that challenge?
Yeah, so let's go through that a little bit. So along the way, we did what's called a friends and family round. So the founders had been saying, well, I have friends and relatives and stuff that want to invest. And I said, well, get them to invest now, because when we do a professional round, that's over. That's not going to happen anymore. And so we did a friends and family round, raised $1 million or $2 million. We did a seed round in early 2020 with a series of investors that were, again, mostly in Alberta, but some of them in the US for about 5 million Canadian. And then we did a Series A financing round that closed at the end of May. So there has been money along the way, and each one of those pools of money essentially sponsored a piece of the work that needed to be done. And each pool is bigger than the previous pool because the next work is always more expensive than the last work.
Right.
And now the Series A was bigger than the seed round, which was bigger than the friends and family round, because the Series A is now to fund the clinical work, whereas the seed round was to fund the preclinical work necessary for getting the product through an IND, which in Canada, where the company's located, is called a CTA, Clinical Trial Application. Health Canada authorized the company to go into clinical studies in March. We closed the round in end of May, and we should be dosing our first patient in the next, I don't know, week maybe.
Oh, wow.
So
That's
the first clinical
exciting.
it'll be very exciting. Our first clinical site is authorized to begin screening and dosing patients. So we're just waiting for the first patient to actually get through the screening process and get dosed.
So this is phase 2.
No,
Oh.
in oncology, it's interesting because it's a cancer company. So the oncology development is totally different than other therapeutic areas. You start in patients. So many of the drugs in cancer are cytotoxic. So it's not considered ethical to give cytotoxic drugs to normal, healthy individuals.
Right.
And cancer patients, you only study this in cancer patients who have basically tried everything else. Right. So cancer patients have to be essentially at the end of their treatment plan with no other options. They can be enrolled in experimental clinical studies. So this is kind of like their last gasp to try new drugs that are being developed. So the phase 1 study in oncology is always in patients. And interestingly enough, in oncology, unlike most other therapeutic areas, you don't necessarily use the traditional study design. The traditional study design is double-blinded, placebo-controlled. Right. So nobody knows who's getting the drug, and there's a placebo, so some patients aren't getting any drug at all. Well, that's also considered unethical in oncology to do a double-blinded, placebo-controlled trial. Right. So the oncology is now doing, at least for the indications that we're developing, open-label studies. No placebo arm, because the patients have failed everything else. If it works on them, it's working.
Right. And why would you give them a placebo?
Like there's a placebo effect that you have to worry about in patients that are declining because they have refractory cancer that is still progressing even after all the other therapies. You don't have to worry about there's some kind of placebo effect you're gonna invoke by giving them a new drug. So that is a nice breakthrough with the FDA that allows us to do clinical studies much more efficiently and use data that previously would have been rejected.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a great breakthrough, because I can recall when we were looking at orphan drugs at one point and some of the issues that, we faced at that time in trying to get orphan drugs approved or being able to test them in individuals who have a very rare disease, and there's no cure and there's no opportunity for them. So now you've got your funding, you're going to, as a startup, you're in this place. Is it different working in the Canadian, FDA versus the United States FDA? Because I know each country has their own sort of FDA and what those challenges might be for a company.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, Canada actually is more stringent on the manufacturing side. So we need to submit our clinical trial application with the certificate of analysis of the batch of drug that we're actually planning to administer to patients in the clinical study. In the U.S., when you submit an IND, you don't have to have the C of A. You have to have all the analytical methods. You have to have stability studies. You have to have, previous batches and batch records and so forth. But you don't have to have the certificate of analysis of the actual clinical batch that you're going to do before you submit it. And so what happens in Canada is that you submit the CTA, and now it's going to go through review. And then after review, the institutional review boards of the clinical sites that you're going to do the clinical studies start their review and get their departments involved. And then only once the CTA has been authorized, which starts the clinical site review, and the clinical sites have an ethics committee that reviews the protocols and everything else. Once they have approved it with whatever revisions they've demanded, only then can you start screening and enrolling patients. So for us, we got authorized in mid-March, and here we are in mid-July, and we are just about ready to start dosing patients. So
In your
that
first
whole
patient.
time period was working with the institutions to get them authorized to start clinical study.
So that's just another bucket of time that you need to really build in. And as an investor, so now you have your Series A and I'm an investor. And this is something that blew me away the other day when you said their exit strategy, that most investors won't even look at something unless their exit is 10 times.
Yeah.
You know, so for every 100,000, you know, that's $1 million. That's a lot of pressure on a startup, especially for as hard.
Not really in pharmaceuticals.
Okay.
If you're successful in pharmaceuticals, what do pharmaceutical companies go for if they're bought out by a big pharma company? They're bought out for hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. Okay. How much money's gone into it by then? I mean, maybe, I don't know. It depends on the company.
Right.
20, 50, 70 million has gone in and it goes out for $1 billion. Well, you know, you made more than your 10x then. So in pharma, if you're successful, not hard to hit. If you're not successful, you know,
it could
it's
be
not successful.
right.
It's gonna be, you know, it's gonna be a write-off for everybody. So so you
The
can
investor,
hit that.
the company, yeah.
If you've done a good job on your market, if you've done a good job on and you've got a good candidate and you're getting good data in the clinic, you can hit that. You can definitely hit that.
So something, you know, as I think about all the little small pharmas out there, and then, you know, the big players, the Pfizers, the J&Js, you know, the AstraZenecas, and a few others. But do you see another big pharma on the horizon, someone who might rise above the crop, like the next Facebook of pharma, if you will?
No.
No.
So unlike, you know, I mean, there is no, I mean, I can always be completely wrong.
Right.
And often am. And
Right.
often am. But if I have to prognosticate in pharmaceuticals is such a capital intensive and regulated environment that those two factors inhibit emergence of some kind of new crop of innovators. Okay, people are innovating within pharma, but pharmaceutical innovations that are really attractive are generally picked up by pharma. You know, they're bought and integrated into the current, you know, pharmaceutical industry. So there are companies that will tend to try to evolve into more traditional pharma. Teva is a great example of that. They started as a generics company in Israel, and they have been moving into what they call branded generics, which means I have a generic, but it's a generic in that there's no IP for the active pharmaceutical ingredient, what we call the API. So there's no patent on that anymore, but there's a patent on the way I've configured it. Okay. And the way I've configured it allows me to charge more for it than I could if it was just a strictly generic drug. And then eventually they're investing now in proprietary drugs, in new drugs. Right. So there are companies that are trying to move up the value chain and become more of a pharmaceutical player. And there are companies like Gilead that are, you know, sort of mid-tier pharmaceutical companies that have really grown a ton over the last, you know, couple of decades. And of course, you know, companies like Amgen in the biotech industry, you know, started out as a biotech and then grew into being a major company. But right now, I think it's really hard to envision a company being able to capitalize itself independently of pharmaceutical relationships that would ending up pulling those assets into the pharma companies themselves. The gravity right now is like a big black hole. They're going to suck everything of value out of whatever entities are developing them. Well,
and you know, we talked about this the other day, but that's because the Pfizers and the Gileads of the world, if you will, they already have the machine in place. Because I think the real time and money comes when you're hitting phase 3 and you have to do thousands and thousands of patients.
Yeah. So when you look at a company and you figure out what's its lifespan and when are you going to exit, one of the considerations is capital and the cost of capital for all the different stages. So the capital at the early stages, the capital needs are relatively modest. You know, you want to do an IND. Generally, the back of the envelope is it's going to cost you about 3 million. But the cost of capital is really high because you're unproven, you're high risk, and so forth. You know, when you get to phase 1, now you need maybe 10 million. And the cost of capital might be a little bit lower because you've done the tox and you've shown that it's not toxic, and you can probably safely administer it to patients, although that's where you're going to find out the answer to that question. And then, you know, it keeps going like that. The next stage for phase 2, maybe you need 40 million, okay, to do phase 2, and the cost of capital is a little bit lower. Raising a lot more capital each one of these times. And you get to a point where the capital you need to raise and the cost of the capital just isn't worth it. It's more inexpensive for pharma to take it from there. And that's why you see so many handoffs at the end of phase 2, is that for pharma to take over and do phase 3, which is the biggest chunk of capital, and then to commercialize it, which is another big chunk of capital. What, you know, a lot of people don't realize, but even if I get an approval, now how am I going to actually market the product? Just because the FDA has said you can now, physicians can write a prescription for this product doesn't mean they will, okay?
Right.
You have to, you know, do all the marketing, all the distribution, all the sales, you know, engage the physicians, you know, show them the proof, engage them at trade shows, in their offices, et cetera. Otherwise, they're just not going to be aware of it. It's just not going to hit the radar.
You have to educate them on what you've just created to solve, you know, somebody's problem. So there's a huge...
And what other people don't realize is there's got a lot of economic incentives built into the medical system to keep things just the way they are, not to change things. And so if you change it too much, shockingly, even though what you're doing might be more effective and better for patients, there's enormous resistance, because if you change the system too much, particularly the system about how doctors get paid or how medical reimbursement occurs or how hospitals are reimbursed or whatever, if you change that too much, there's resistance, because now it's going to cost them. Even if you can make patients better now, and before it was not possible, if it costs them money to do that, there's going to be a lot of resistance. I mean, they may eventually have to do that, but it's not like they're going to embrace that. And that's one of the weird, perverse things about our particular medical system, which is yet another session, is that we have a lot of perverse incentives built into the medical system that actually inhibits or rejects innovation because it changes too much of the way the system's set up. And in that change, you have disincentivized innovation. You know, physicians, if they're treating a patient a particular way, they have to come in the office and I have to see them and I get to do an assessment and so forth. And I collect every time they come in the office, and they have to come in every month. And I'm going to give them something that cures them. They come in once, they get a script, and they're done. I've lost huge income stream. You know, it's the same in some surgeries. I do a surgical repair on this. I've got surgeons making, you know, a certain amount per procedure every time they repair this. Now it's going to be done with a device. You know, we're going to give them a device and that's going to fix it. Wait a minute. What happened to all that income I was getting from this? You know, certain people have built up practices around certain diseases where they offer the most efficient version of the current practice. And their whole practice, you know, not the whole practice, but a ton of the practice and the profit of the practice is built around their efficiently performing a procedure, et cetera.
Right.
You take that away, man, there's going to be resistance like crazy. No.
There's an economic impact.
And we don't want to change it. That's right. There's an economic impact.
There's an economic impact. Wow, you're right. That could be a whole other conversation. This has been fascinating, and I'm so appreciative of your time, Michael, and the conversation that we've had. I can't thank you enough. And certainly for our audience, you know, those out there in the pharmaceutical world, I think there's a lot of information here that will help them sort of navigate and move forward, you know. And as you said the other day, it really is the storytelling. And I don't think what I realized was the amount of information on this particular, you know, startup environment that is needed to tell an effective story. So thank you.
If you're going to talk to sophisticated investors who understand the space, if you don't speak the language they're waiting to hear, and you don't talk about all the different attributes that they're expecting to hear about, and you haven't solved all the problems of all that chain of events that has to occur, or have a clear path to solving the problems in that chain of events that has to occur, then, you know, they're not going to move forward. They're going to find, you know, go to the next one. So pharmaceuticals is definitely probably the hardest or one of the hardest things you can possibly work in as an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
So anybody in your audience who's working in that space as an entrepreneur, my hat's off to you, and so most of my hair as well, because it is really, a enormous challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. It's been really great talking to you. And I will we'll post this on our Startup Grind global YouTube channel. And I'll send you a link so you can share it with all of your colleagues and other entrepreneurs out there who are in that pharmaceutical environment.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your questions and the opportunity to share a little bit of my experience.
Yeah, and it does sound like it was a war story, so good for you. All right, well, thank you very much. Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Bye, Michael.
All right, bye-bye.